And it was talking about a history professor at American University in DC. His name is Alan Lichtman. And he apparently has accurately predicted nearly every presidential race since 1984. And he's predicting that Biden will win.
I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovic. And we are unapologetically outspoken. Hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday. So we are now just a little over 6 months away from what Stephanie and I firmly believe is going to be the most critical election of our lifetime. That is, unless we conveniently end up not having an election at all. But we thought today it would be fun to go over some recent polls and research and kind of get an idea of where most Americans stand. And I think we have a pretty good idea that it's clear Biden's ratings are in the toilet, but the media, and especially the left-leaning media, is still reporting that his approval ratings are high and he and Trump are like neck and neck in the polls, which I personally just don't understand how that can be true at this point. And the New York Post reported over the weekend that a Gallup poll released last Friday shows that Biden is literally the least popular US president ever in the last 70 years, even below Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter. And his job approval rating for the first quarter of this year is 38.7%, which puts him in a weaker position than any incumbent has ever been in before. So then I come across this article in Audacity that was published on Monday. And it was talking about a history professor at American University in DC. His name is Alan Lichtman. And he apparently has accurately predicted nearly every presidential race since 1984. And he's predicting that Biden will win. And he did an interview with MarketWatch. And there was also an article that came out in the Daily Mail earlier this month about his predictions. And I guess this guy wrote a book back in the 1980s detailing a system he calls 13 keys that he uses to predict the outcome of the popular vote. And it's based solely on historical factors and has nothing to do with polls, tactics, or campaign events. And I guess the only time that this guy has been wrong was back in 2000 when he predicted that Al Gore would win. And he's saying his prediction was only wrong because it was a stolen election. So this guy is saying that even though polls are showing Biden is in trouble and he's behind in several swing states, he believes that polls 6 to 7 months before an election have zero predictive value. And I think there's some truth to this because let's look at the 2020 election and the polls were showing that Trump was way ahead of Biden. And then look what mysteriously happened, overnight when all these votes suddenly appeared in the 11th hour for Biden. I call what happened election fraud, but you can make up your own mind. And then there's another guy named John Kane, and he uses data analysis to make predictions. And he recently did a research paper, and there's a whole article about it in Time magazine that came out on Monday, talking about how looking at all of the presidential elections since 1952 over the past 72 years, incumbent candidates have won the popular vote 78% of the time. And his argument is that this gives Biden an advantage that isn't being represented in his low poll numbers because most of the lag in his approval rating is coming from his own Democratic Party, where reportedly between 15 and 20% of Democrats haven't voiced approval for him yet. But when push comes to shove, they're going to choose Biden over Trump to keep the incumbent and a Democrat in office. And this guy compared Biden's first term to that of Obama's, where back in 2011, Obama was struggling and his approval rating was identical to what Biden's is now. And people were viewing the economy as overwhelmingly negative, and it looked like Obama was losing to Mitt Romney in the polls. But then Obama won the two-party vote share by 4 percentage points. And this guy even takes his research back to the Civil War era, where he says results tell the same story across the entire timeline, that incumbent presidents average well over 50% of two-party vote shares, and incumbency is one of the most consistently powerful predictors of election outcomes. And so this Gallup poll that I mentioned earlier also claims that every incumbent in the past 7 decades with an approval rating over 50% has won a second term, with the exception of Obama. But the New York Post article also mentioned that no first term president in Gallup's history has won a second term with approval numbers as low as Biden's, who again has worse results in this quarter before the election, to the point that he's ranked among the worst presidents in the bottom 12% of all presidents going back to 1945. So, is history going to repeat itself with historical data leaning towards incumbents? And do these polls even matter? What do you think, Stephanie?
I don't think the polls matter. I don't trust the polls, but I mean, he is historically bad. So it's like, I don't think we could really look at like modern recent history, as a predictor, because he is just like so far way worse than any president in our lifetime. But like the polls said that Hillary would win in 2016, and then they said Trump would win in 2020. And they were wrong. So I really don't trust them. I feel like they're always skewed. But I will say, like, I've seen a massive shift over, I would say, the past year to 2 years, both in my personal life and on social media, where more and more people are feeling comfortable speaking out against Biden and saying that they're for Trump. And, it's so different from in 2020, because in 2020, it was like the majority of people were too afraid to voice their opinion because you had cancel culture going on, people being censored left and right, people even losing their jobs over voicing their opinion. So everyone was sort of timid and afraid to speak out, but that's really not the case anymore. I mean, you see people from all walks of life going to social media and, coming forward about what they think is happening right now. We can all see it, right? And so, with the degree to which things have gotten so bad in the country, I think most people, most sane people know we can't go on any longer with Biden. But with that being said, I still think the Democrats have a surprise up their sleeve, like another candidate that they're gonna, choose at the convention. So I don't want to, for 1 second, think that it's a slam dunk for Trump. It's not. But I also don't really trust the polls. I take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I agree. But let's get into some recent polls just for fun. And I want you guys to keep in mind, we've said this on the podcast before. These polls are clearly subjective, especially when you take into consideration the population that's being polled and the political perspective of the polling agency and the very sometimes guided questions. So some of the results are like often very biased, but let's take a look at some numbers anyway and the demographics. So, first, I want to talk about on Monday, there was an article in Newsweek, and it was highlighting that Trump's biggest problem is going to be women voters. And because of this, Republicans are going to struggle getting females to vote for him in the upcoming election. And according to the article, polls are showing that the proportion of women who plan to vote for Trump is less than the proportion who voted for him in 2020. And the experts are saying this is because of Trump's views on abortion and also his recent legal cases because they involve women. We talked about this on Monday, but two of Trump's major cases being highlighted in the media right now both involve women. There's the criminal election interference hush money trial related to his affair with Stormy Daniels. And then back in January, he had to pay that $83 million in damages to E. Jean Carroll related to the civil defamation in an alleged sexual assault case. And on top of that, Trump has been accused of sexual assault by more than a dozen women. And even though there's been no proof of any of these allegations, there is a large percentage of women who literally hate Trump because of this. Not to mention his recorded comment from a few years ago about grabbing women by the pussy. So now you have a female voter base that just hates him because of this. So the Pew Research Center reported that Trump's vote share among women in 2020 was 44%, and Biden had 55% of the female vote. But according to a January Quinnipiac University poll of registered voters, 58% of women now back Biden, while only 36% back Trump, which is also a drop from a poll that they did in December. And similar numbers were reported this month by the New York Times and Siena College, which is supposedly like the most accurate pollster in the country, according to this Newsweek article. But that poll gave Biden a 16-point lead over Trump when it comes to women, with Biden receiving 53% of the vote and Trump receiving 37. And Newsweek also conducted their own poll recently, which showed that the gender divide in American politics is becoming wider, with men becoming increasingly more conservative and women becoming more liberal. Liberal? My God. Liberal. Presumably because of the ongoing abortion debate after the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade back in 2022. And at the time, and he's continued to kind of stick with this stance, Trump said he believes abortion limits should be left to the states. And this clearly triggered a lot of women who I think don't even understand Roe versus Wade in the first place, but that's a whole other thing. And Biden's team, on the other hand, is using this to their advantage with women voters. And he's been making abortion rights the number one focus of his campaign platform. Wow, I'm really like having trouble speaking today. Like that's not normal. Anyway, um, and we hear about this ad nauseum, right? When Biden gets on a microphone and he mumbles about how Trump wants to take reproductive rights away from women, and his goal is to restore them. So, a recent CBS YouGov poll showed that 40% of people polled in key swing states expressed anger about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So, this will possibly come into play with their votes. There is an associate professor of politics at the University of Surrey in the UK who said he believes Trump comes across as too aggressive and macho, and that puts off female voters. And then this guy, Thomas Whalen, who's an associate professor who teaches US politics at Boston University, agreed that the abortion debate is Trump's biggest hurdle with women. What do you think, Stephanie? Do you think women are his biggest problem?
I mean, I do think it's a problem because, like you said, most of these people don't understand Roe versus Wade and don't understand like this simply turned the power over to the states. Like they just think it means there's no abortions allowed or whatever. I don't know what they think, but I don't think they're looking into the facts here. And Trump has said that he's not going to do a federal abortion ban. And when states banning abortion came up, he said he thinks that that would get overturned and that they would come to a more reasonable agreement. So it's not like he's, saying he's 100% against abortion. He just believes there should be limits. But in today's world, that makes you a far right conservative because these wacky people think it's okay to abort a baby at 9 months for any reason whatsoever. And at the end of the day, like we're talking about people that are going to do whatever the liberal media tells them to do, right? So I don't think that they'll vote Trump in any scenario, even if Roe versus Wade wasn't overturned and that wasn't even an issue. I think there's this group of voters, mostly women, white liberal women, that just won't vote for him based off of like emotions. Yet these same people think it's totally fine that Biden overturned Title IX. So like we can't look at it as educated people making a reasonable decision. We have to realize that there's plenty of people out there that don't do their research and they just go along with whatever their media bubble tells them. And I mean, I'm hoping that's what our podcast is helping to change by actually educating women about politics and like getting the facts straight. But there's far too many ignorant people voting. So there's that. But when you look at how important the economy is to voters and the fact that most women are the ones that are in charge of like their family finances, I can't imagine they would vote for Biden, but again, there's a lot of misinformed people voting based on emotion instead of policy. So, it's hard to say, but it's like at the end of the day, if you can't afford groceries and your mortgage, I don't think that abortion is going to be something that's going to determine who you vote for. You'll vote for the person that's going to help the economy. And then the other big thing is the border and national security. And I feel like most women, especially mothers, don't want war and don't want crime in our country. And so it's like, again, if you're worried that you're going to get raped riding the subway to work or your kid is going to get drafted in war, I don't think abortion is going to be the main issue that you focus on. but that's just me. That's just my opinion.
Well, you also brought up the economy. So let's take a look at that because I think this is one of the biggest factors, at least for mainstream America. Bidenomics has been a complete fucking failure to the point where Biden has even abandoned the idea. And even though inflation has cooled off recently, interest rates are still absolutely ridiculous. Gas and food prices are incredibly high. They're definitely higher than they were under Trump, and you can't argue that. But is this enough of an issue to significantly impact the election? I think Democrats are getting worried about the Black community defecting and supporting Trump, which we've talked about in previous podcasts. And now you've got Kamala out on the campaign trail trying to convince Black voters that Biden has their best interest at heart. And she's talking about how he's taking action to increase Black entrepreneurship access to capital and lower housing costs and lessen their college debt and medical bills. But there's a new poll that came out from CBS and YouGov last week that looked at how voters in key states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin are viewing voting Trump over Biden. And when it came to the economy, 62% said the economy was better under Trump, with 36% saying it's better under Biden. I don't even understand that. But that was when it came to and when it came to their personal finances, 47% said that they would be better off financially if Trump wins, compared to only 21% of people believing they'd be better off with Biden. And the conflicting factor for a lot of people seems to be the perceived threats to democracy issue, because apparently a lot of people don't understand that Biden is the true threat to democracy because his democracy propaganda seems to be like equally ranked with Trump's focus on bettering the economy.
But here's the thing with the whole threat to democracy. Like, I'm worried about the threat to democracy, but I'm worried about it if Trump isn't elected, because we all know the real threat is Biden. And so I always think about this, like when they do these polls, are they just throwing out threat to democracy? Like, are they asking specifically who is the threat, or are they just asking about the threat in general? Because there is a threat. I'm worried about it. I think a lot of Americans are worried about it. But the media and the pollsters would just assume that if you answer yes to that question, it's because Trump's the bad guy and Biden's the savior. When I think most people, it's the opposite. So I like that question. I feel like I can't even look at in polls because I don't think they're even asking it correctly.
Yeah, and you know what was surprising to me is even former Attorney General Bill Barr is agreeing. Like after the whole January 6th incident, he made it very clear that Trump should never be allowed near the Oval Office again. And yet he just recently told CNN that he would vote for Trump over Biden. And he said, quote, I think Biden is unfit for office. I think Trump would do less damage than Biden. And I think all this stuff about a threat to democracy, I think the real threat to democracy is the progressive movement and the Biden admin, end quote. And on this whole threat to democracy narrative, the Washington Examiner reported yesterday that a new Harvard CAPS poll that was released on Monday found that 71% of respondents believe that if Biden was found guilty in being involved with Hunter's shady business dealings while he was vice president, it would be an impeachable offense. And this is coming from the majority in all political affiliations. So 52% of Democrats, 89% of Republicans, and 74% of independents believe that this situation would warrant Biden's impeachment. But I don't have a lot of faith in the House investigation going anywhere because it's been, what, 15 months already? And so far, nothing has come of it. But let's talk about young people, right? Young voters. So I was reading a CBS article that was breaking down that CBS YouGov poll I have mentioned a couple times. And it was talking about how even though Biden's approval rating is slipping among younger voters because of his handling of the Israel-Hamas conflict, the article was saying approving of that or disapproving is not the same as voting, and that one is an evaluation and the other is a choice, and that young voters who want Biden to tell Israel to stop military actions in Gaza are still likely to vote for him. And I think that's probably true. But Stephanie, I think you have a lot more input on this one than I do because you see a lot of the youth influence on TikTok. And like, so are you seeing stuff that's confirming this?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think he has lost young Americans, like just in general. I don't think he has a chance with them. So it's like, look at what we're seeing with these protests, or just go and spend 20 minutes on TikTok and you'll see the young progressives, they have just as much like visceral hate for Biden right now as they did for Trump in 2020. And I even was listening to this one progressive girl who was having this debate with like her friend, and she's like, no, the guy that is committing genocide is worse than a guy who makes tweets we don't like. So like they're really, I mean, they hate Biden. And it's just funny. It's like, look at how the tables have turned. So the other thing we're seeing is the Genocide Joe memes are like everywhere. They are everywhere. And if there's one thing about young people, they follow the crowd and they're going to follow what's on social media. And social media is like painting him as this genocidal maniac. And so I think that you're going to see a lot of these voters just completely abstaining from voting. Um, I really don't think that like any of the people that are out there chanting, Genocide Joe are actually going to go and vote for Biden. I don't think that they're going to go and vote for Trump either, but it really doesn't matter because if they don't vote at all, it's going to hurt Biden a hell of a lot more than it hurts Trump. Like really the Democratic Party as a whole is dependent on these young voters. And, aside from the whole Israel Hamas thing, Biden just has no appeal to young people. Like he's an easy target to make fun of. He's constantly, doing these cringy things. And as we heard with my teenage daughter, it's no longer cool to be a liberal Biden supporter. Trump, however, all of a sudden it is cool, at least here in Florida. Like my daughter was even asking if we could get Trump shirts and go to a rally, and it's like that never would have happened in 2020. And what's interesting is young men are consistently polling more conservative for the first time since 2014. The other thing, though, the flip side of that is that young women are, according to the polls, more liberal than at any point in history. So there is like that balance. But what pisses me off is like I was trying to go through and just, keep an open mind looking at these polls. But first of all, when you type in polling, the only articles that come up in a normal search at the top are from the far left liberal universities like Harvard, or articles from like the New York Times or the LA Times. And again, like that's why I don't trust polls. Like these are obviously very biased left leaning organizations. And they try to, skew the results to make it look like everyone is a liberal. So I'm just going to give an example of this. There was a Reuters article that was going over this trend of young men leaning more conservative than any other population group. And this article says, quote, social media algorithms were magnifying the trend by drawing moderately conservative young men towards more extreme and radical conservative male role models and worldviews, end quote. So, like, clearly they're painting this picture that, like, people that lean right are these whack job radicals and it's all social media to blame. But the fact is that, like, I think most young men just don't like this whole trans agenda. They don't like that masculinity is being attacked left and right. And the whole thing with social media is complete BS because we all know that the conservative stuff is the stuff that's censored the most. And if anything, they're pushing the left wing stuff to young people. So that's just what I mean, how ridiculous like these organizations are. But forget the polls for a second. Just look at our culture. Like, look at who is at the top of the podcast charts consistently. You have Joe Rogan, Andy Frisella, Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, and a bunch of other very masculine men that are right leaning or outright very conservative. And I think that just goes to show like young men want masculine role models. They want real men they can look up to, not a bunch of like whiny feminine men that believe that gender is a spectrum. And quite honestly, I think there's a lot of women that crave that as well. I know, like I do, I would much rather see that. And then on TikTok, I'm seeing more and more women speaking up and leaning right. And again, we never would have seen that in 2020, but we see it all the time now on social media. And then the other thing to look at is look at like all of these conservative songs that have come out over the past 2 years that immediately hit the top of the charts, that even beat out people like Taylor Swift. So I think looking at the culture, like we're seeing a massive shift. Of course, this is just my opinion, but I think that most Americans are hungry for normalcy. I think that we have whack jobs that have completely hijacked this country. And I think any normal person out there with some common sense that pays attention to what's actually happening just wants things to be normal. And you're not going to keep voting for Biden if you want things to be normal, because obviously what's happening right now is anything but that. Sorry, I'll stop. I'll get off my soapbox.
No, I agree with you 100%. But at the same time, I just keep seeing shit that I find concerning. And literally right before we sat down to record this podcast, I had a Fox News article come across my feed, and there's a clip in it that just made me cringe when I heard it. Like, we know the left is brainwashing our kids, especially in college, and we've seen what's been happening all over the country with these mass protests on colleges, which are still like ongoing, by the way. That's a whole other podcast. But these students at Vanderbilt, which is a very prestigious university, were recently interviewed about who they plan to vote for in the upcoming election. And Stephanie, this just confirms for me how fucked we are with this generation of completely ignorant and brainwashed young college students who are all eligible to vote. So I want to play this clip so you can hear what they had to say. And the first question is, do you know who you plan to vote for in the upcoming election? Hang on, I can't get the stupid sound. 2 seconds. On the screen, they're asking the question.
Oh, okay.
I don't really like either option, so that's where I'm at, but I don't know yet. I don't. I think that I need to continue watching. I actually took a course about democracy here at Vanderbilt, and it was very enriching. I got to speak with a lot of people in politics, so I will be keeping all of these ideas in mind as I continue to educate myself. Not yet. I still have to do more research, honestly.
Someone who's going to legalize marijuana. I'm almost certainly going to be voting for President Joe Biden, just because I've liked a lot of what he's done in terms of policy. I know he doesn't have the best image, so to speak, nowadays. I don't know why.
Yeah, not Trump. So yeah, I'll be Democratic probably. I think it's important, like, especially in class, we talk about not just voting on based on what you've done historically, like actually listening and thinking about it. Right now, I think my views align more with the Democratic Party, but I will be educating myself and making sure I know exactly what's happening, but not Trump.
I think for anybody who knows how to, read the news and see what kind of policy changes are being made, we'll see that, Joe Biden is an excellent president. He's definitely in the better half of presidents we've had. I would even go so far as to say he's a top 15 president in history. So even if he's ancient, I'm still going to be voting for him because he's shown that him and his cabinet can get things done. Fighting inflation was the best thing that he did. And him and his Bidenomics, I think people kind of use that as a negative term, but I definitely believe that his work against inflation has been very good, especially after COVID. I think he did a lot. Actually, come to think of it, I think the best thing he did was help guide America out of the COVID crisis that I think Trump was partially responsible for.
Okay, it's not over. But the next question is, what are the most important issues to you as a voter?
For me, climate change is a big issue that I focus on when I vote. But more than that, I think candidates that allow for civil discourse to be part of the way that they conduct politics is important to me.
Yeah, probably marijuana legalization.
Affordable housing. Yes. I just think one issue that's really important to me right now is just protecting women's rights and so that's definitely something I consider when voting. Yeah, I think just because times are really tense right now, people want to know that they're looking out for what we want, and they're being honest about what's happening in the government and things like that. So that's really what I'm looking for. I think that bridging that gap between who can tell me what is actually happening in the economy with statistics and being able to relay that message to the wider public so that they can see the actual changes is something that's really important to me.
I look for progressivism because I care a lot about, moving our society to a state where, people can live happily and freely. And I think one of the hot button issues that I'm concerned with is abortion. So I'll be looking for a candidate who is, of course, pro-choice. Something I'm very much concerned about, especially as I'm going to be needing to get my own house or my own living space in the next few years. Any candidate that has some kind of policy for reduced housing prices because they've been too expensive to live in for some time now. I don't know if any candidate's going to be running with that. It doesn't really seem like it.
Okay.
Was that the same guy who said that he loves what Biden has done with inflation?
Yes. And that's what I was just about to point out.
Oh my
Like,
God.
they interviewed the same people with both questions. And the females that were like, oh, I'm not voting for Trump, like, I'm definitely voting for Biden, were the same females who were saying they were wanting transparency in government.
Yeah.
And like,
And
it
she
just
cares
blows
about
my
women's
mind.
rights. Can you ask her
Right.
about Title IX?
Right.
What Biden
It's
just
so
did?
It's so fucking backwards to me. It's like they literally have no fucking idea what's going on.
These schools are making people like dumber. I really believe
Yes.
that it's one big indoctrination camp, really. I actually listened to a study about that yesterday, and it's like literally they're making them dumber the further they go in our universities. Yeah, it's alarming. But at the same time, it's like I think about when I was a college student, I was a fucking idiot. Like I had
Oh,
no
me
life
too.
experience. My parents paid for everything. I had no responsibility, never owned a home, didn't have a full-time job where my taxes were being taken out of my pay. You know what I mean? It's like they have nothing to base it off of. So they pay attention to these things that really are not the key issues they should be paying attention to. And that is
Okay.
scary.
I have to tell you this. It's very embarrassing, but I'll just admit it anyway. So I was such an idealist in college. I went to Berkeley, like one of the
Mhm.
most liberal schools in the nation. And I majored in English and Native American studies because I wanted to go into federal Indian law. And like, I remember writing a paper about how I just wanted to go live on an Indian reservation. Like, that's
Oh.
how my head was so in the clouds. So I get it, but it just frightens me because voting and elections weren't a big thing when I was in college. I mean, it wasn't
Mhm.
like it is today. And these young people have an opportunity to be the deciding factor in the direction that our country goes in. And that
Yeah.
fucking scares me. And like, on a separate note, let's face this, we can't ignore the fact that there's a significant percentage of the population that doesn't want Trump or Biden.
Mhm.
And that poll, that CBS YouGov poll I mentioned earlier, one of the things that was interesting to me about it was that it was focused on emotions. And participants were asked to rank Trump and Biden using the question, how does each candidate make you feel? And like you mentioned earlier, people have very visceral emotions to Trump and to Biden. And this poll was using terms like worried, insecure, angry, calm, secure, and confident. Those are the parameters. And both Trump and Biden elicited more responses of worry than confidence, more insecurity than security, and a lot of anger. The most common vote with Biden was feelings of worry, and the most elicited feeling with Trump was anger, which is what's like fueling opposition towards him. But participants were also asked the question, who better understands people like you? And Trump narrowly won out at 42% over Biden's 40%. And then you had 16% of participants who said neither.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like I was kind of in that bucket up until the Mar-a-Lago raid because I didn't want to deal with the anti-Trumpers. Like, it's not that I was against him. I was just fucking sick and tired of it. But things have gotten so bad in our country with Biden and then them attacking Trump, it like made me, want to stand up for him. So I could see how those numbers are that way, but I think it's true. I think there's so many people basing it on emotion instead of policy. But I will say something big that I think has changed since the 2020 election is that in 2020, there were a lot of people that I personally knew, but I think this is just like a general thing in our country that didn't vote for Trump just because they were afraid of the left rioting if he won. Like, I remember having that conversation with so many of my friends that were like, yeah, like I like his policies, but I'm just sick and tired of the riots. And so I'm not going to vote for him. And based on what we're seeing now with the pro-Palestinian protests, I think it's the opposite. Like, I think it's flip-flopped, where if Biden gets reelected, it's most likely to result in these crazy ass riots and protests.
Okay, but that is dependent on what happens with this Israel Hamas war. And I know right now, like, Biden is really trying to push to get Netanyahu to calm it down. And there's still, what, 6.5 months left before the election. So if the situation changes with Israel Hamas, like, I think that could work in Biden's favor with people believing that he's the one that turned it around.
We know, I mean, come on, Israel, they're going to wipe out all of Palestine. Like, I don't think they're going to calm down. I really don't. Maybe they will. And if they do, you're right. Like, I think that'll help Biden, but I don't think they're going to slow down at all. I think they are going to annihilate, these Palestinian people. I don't know. I'm just saying, like, we'll see. It'll be interesting. But with that being said, though, like, I feel like the Antifa crowd that was really the spark behind all the riots in 2020, I think that same crowd is the Palestinian crowd. I think Soros is paying these Antifa people to infiltrate this. So I do, it's just, there's no telling. There's no telling with that. But I think that a lot of people are over that fear of like, oh, I want the rioting to stop. I think people are sick and tired of going to the grocery store and they can't afford to pay to fill their cart. So anyhow, I want to talk about the most interesting poll that I have seen as of recently. And this was actually on a recent episode of the Tucker Carlson podcast. So there was this guy, Justin Haskins, and he's part of the Heartland Institute. And they conducted a poll based on mail-in voting during the 2020 election. And the results are pretty astounding. So one of the questions they asked was, did you vote in a state where you are no longer a legal resident? And 17% of people admitted yes, they did. Then they asked if they filled out a ballot for someone else, and 21% of people said yes, they did. Then they asked people if they forged the signature of a friend or family member, and 17% of people said yes. These things are all illegal. It's all fraud. The fact that people admitted this, even if it was anonymous, is like outrageous. But that is alarming. And they also asked them, do you know anyone that admitted to you that they conducted voter fraud? And at least 10% of people said yes. And so when you look at the 2020 election, it had more mail-in ballots than any election in history. And let's not forget that we live in a time where we can't even say the word election without getting censored. Like, imagine that. We hear about all these threats of democracy, yet we're not allowed to even talk about elections. And we certainly can't question elections without being censored or banned. And so here's another important fact to keep in the back of your mind. Joe Biden had twice as many mail-in ballots than Trump. But when you look in swing states specifically, like Pennsylvania, for example, Biden had 70% mail-in ballots compared to 30% for Trump. And there is zero reasoning for this. There's never been a reason provided for why this is. This is statistically impossible, but we're not allowed to ask the question. So it's like, put the pieces together, draw your own conclusion. But I think it's very eye-opening if there's anyone out there still questioning 2020.
Yeah, especially considering the majority of these mail-in votes came in suddenly at the last minute, right?
Yep.
So, and I think there's going to be a whole other issue entirely when it comes to voter fraud. Like, not to mention the push to register these millions of illegal migrants coming across the border as Biden voters. And the fact that we already know, like, shady shit's going to go down with the voting machines and the mail in ballots and the dead people voting and like every other fraudulent method of voting. We already know this is going to happen. And like you said earlier, Trump doesn't have it in the bag at this point, and it's still possible that he could end up in prison before the elections even take place. So it's anybody's game. And I still think Biden will be removed at the last minute and replaced with another candidate if the left can't get rid of Trump. And then there's the issue of whether or not we'll even have an election in the first place, because I still believe that if Biden's ratings continue to fall and Trump continues to climb in the polls and they can't get rid of him, there will be some kind of incident like a war or a pandemic that's going to prevent an election altogether. So I'm going to go totally off topic here because speaking of pandemic, Stephanie, you know how I'm getting totally obsessed with the propaganda behind the spread of the bird flu? Because I just feel like they really want this to be the next big combo of like climate emergency slash pandemic push. And since I look up articles all the time, the algorithm is just now sending me bird flu updates like every day. And so, living in Florida, I thought you might be interested to know that the University of Florida researchers have discovered a case of bird flu in a Florida bottlenose dolphin in Dixie County. And this is the first finding of the virus in a cetacean in North America. And the dolphin has died from the virus, which was discovered in both her lungs and her brain. And postmortem diagnostics have ruled out the presence of any other potential medical issues. So the death is indeed from bird flu. And according to Richard Webby, who directs the WHO Collaborating Center for Studies on Ecology of Influenza in Animals and Birds, he said, "We still don't know where the dolphin got the virus, and more research needs to be done." So I guess now we can add dolphins to the growing list of unexpected species contracting the bird flu. And by the way, the United States is now starting to test meat samples for bird flu, even though they've repeatedly said that meat should be safe. But that's also what they said about pasteurized milk, even though the virus has been found in 20% of milk samples in the last 2 weeks. So I'm sure I will have another update for you guys on this next week because the problem just continues to evolve.
Sure sounds a lot like COVID, where when you just start testing everything, you're going to see more of it, even if there's not a reason to test for it. So, like, how the fuck does a dolphin get the bird flu? I mean, come on.
Right.
Like, this is so ridiculous. But
And that's where I
anyhow,
that's where I think the climate change narrative is going to come in because it's killing off all the wildlife. And so it will be the climate change narrative combined with we have to get rid of our food supply.
they're going to tie it all together right before the
Yeah.
election. Oh my
Yeah.
God. Okay, well, we need to end this episode on a positive note because this stuff is just like, it's too much. Okay, so I want to give a shout out to Valerie Kennedy for her awesome outspoken Facebook post. And it says, quote, "Happy Monday and welcome to another fucked up day in America. With continuous anti-Semitism aggression at Ivy League schools and around the world, there is a blanket of comfort I have recently found. I have found some comfort in knowing that I'm not the only woman who thinks America is in dire need of a hard reset. Thankfully, I have found a podcast that I have incorporated into my life and my husband's life. I am giving this amazing podcast 5 stars, 2 thumbs up, and an all-out hell frickin' yeah. If you're a woman who sees the wrong path this country is taking with our rights," and then it says trans rights are not women's rights in parentheses, "the influence we should have on our children, crime is on the rise, politicians making fools of the taxpayers pretty much worldwide, not to mention rights to protect your home and family. Honestly, the list goes on, and I am sick of it. The transference of the definition of respect went from hardworking citizens to now being berated by the mentally ill, politicians speaking on our behalf for their personal gains, our country placing the needs of everyone else but the American people, and where race only matters if you have a race card to play. Oh, and all Jewish people are Satan. If you want to hear an enriching female-based view on all this shit, I strongly encourage you to listen to Unapologetically Outspoken podcast. I really don't think you'll regret it. P.S. If the left keeps this up, white men and women will be the minority, and then we will be the underdogs. And just as the Jewish people have always done as the minority group, we will stand for freedom and the pursuit of happiness. And then she says, unapologetically a proud Republican and Jewish woman. Well, Valerie, thank you very much. We hear you and we're standing with you. And don't
Yes.
ever let these Soros-funded protesters make you think that the majority is against you, because they're not. And we're going to, continue to stand up for what's right. And that includes denouncing anti-Semitism. And yeah, thanks for sharing that. That made my day. I sent that to Tara
Yes.
and I'm like, this is the most amazing post ever. So thank
It
you
is
so much.
awesome, Valerie. Thank you.
Yes, keep sharing, keep being outspoken, and we'll see you back here on Friday. Thanks for tuning in. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.